F1 2023 and the Canadian Grand Prix saw, I think, an all-time great podium. Verstappen taking the top spot, followed by a hard-fought battle between Alonso and Hamilton, second and third, joined by Adrian Newey. 100 wins for Red Bull, 200 wins for Newey today, 11 World Championships between the drivers themselves on the podium, and a mere 376 F1 wins on that podium. Not bad. They were followed home by Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, fastest lapper Perez, and in seventh, driver of the day, Alex Albon in his Williams. I'm Martyn Lee from the Autosport podcast, and with me today, John Noble in Montreal and our Grand Prix editor, Alex Kalinauckas, back home. Right, John, we'll start with driver of the day for a change. Alex Albon, surprise seventh. A really solid defending effort. Best Williams result since George Russell's podium in 2021 in Belgium. But James Vowles said earlier this week to us that some of the parts of Williams are 20 years out of date in his opinion. So what does that say about how good Albon was today?
Well, I think it's a combination of car and driver. I think we've seen the Williams have strengths. It's not been a terrible car this year. There's been strengths. Remember Australia, how brilliant it was in certain sectors. We know it's super slippery, very aero efficient. What it's lacked is downforce. The team has thrown more downforce on the car. Pretty extensive upgrade this weekend. It's new power unit as well came into the pool to that bit of extra boost power. I think they've thrown everything at it, knowing that this weekend was an opportunity to play to the strengths of that car, use performance, and Alex played it brilliantly. It's one thing having a super slippery car, but to have all that, all your rivals breathing down your neck, and this is an Alpine, this is a top 4, top 5 car right behind him almost that entire stint. Great performance from him, performing at top level. Things may get more difficult when you go to higher downforce tracks. The Williams is still behind, and it's still a long journey back before they can get right up there fighting for podiums and potentially even more. But when the opportunity is there, that team's well able to grab that chance and go for it.
Alex, what do you think about Albon's drive today, his tyre management, the fact that nobody could get past him, and his fastest lap wasn't even in the top 10, I think, fastest lap times that I saw, but it was a great defensive driving display, deploying his energy when he needed to and getting a great result today.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, terrific from Alex Albon. Not quite a flawless performance. There was one little off when he was trying to attack Kevin Magnussen. Oscar Piastri nipped back past him at that Wall of Champions chicane, but, that's just me being very picky there. Yeah, superb driving from Alex Albon. A one-stopper, very, very tricky. The sort of the Ferraris and Perez, we're going to come and talk about them later on. They went for the same thing and it worked out very nicely. And it was really the only thing that was going to get Williams sort of, it's certainly into the points, given how, the positioning of the car once things had shaken out and that sort of first stint. But what I thought was really, really interesting was the way Albon, as you say, Martin, you mentioned the deployment, but just the way he was able to, get the traction perfect, be flawless when he needed to. So Ocon, and when it was Russell behind him before that, they weren't getting anywhere near him. But just going back to that quote you gave about what James Vowles has said about things being 20 years out of date, is few interesting things around that. One, I spoke to James in Spain, did an interview with him there in the Williams motorhome. So basically in that interview, he said, look, part of my tactic to get Williams into a better position is I've got to actually make the team look bad so that everybody realises what a dire situation we're in, and we can get rules like the bit in the cost cap where they talk about capital expenditure, possibly get that changed. He said, look, I'm willing to do that because it's a step that's got to be done so that we can take the investment that the team has now got and make a tangible difference. So that's the sort of thinking there from what he's doing when he's coming out with what look like these sort of really openly, really, really frank things from a team boss. But also, they went for the one-stopper, now the strategy call, but a pre-weekend strategy call, also key here, new engine in Albon's car at a track where they knew they were going to need to be quick in a straight line, as they always have been, put that in, and it paid off. Points. Fantastic job from Williams today.
John, let's talk about Mercedes. George Russell in particular, because he caused the only safety car today. Many people might think there was going to be more safety cars or virtual safety cars in Canada than there was. In fact, not been a busy season for safety cars. But today it was George Russell that brought that out with just a simple mistake, but a really big impact affecting the front and rear of the car. He crawled back. I thought he was out, but he crawled back to the pits, managed to get back out again, but eventually retired with brake issues. But have you spoken to the team and maybe even to George? And I've seen some stuff after the race where he doesn't think that the impact is what actually caused his retirement. Can you shed any more light on what happened there at Mercedes?
Yeah, I think it boils down to more a kind of a consequence of the accident rather than the accident itself that triggered the retirement, because obviously dropped him back into the pack. And Formula One is such a brutal sport where teams are chasing the finest millisecond of everything. How your car's set up, how its brake cooling is set up, is all based on where you anticipate being against the opposition. So Mercedes qualifying second row here would have gone into the race thinking you could go pretty clear air for most of that race. You can manage it. You often see drivers sitting 1.5, 2 seconds behind, running in clear air, keeping everything nice and cool. But the second he's dropped back into the pack, obviously you're chasing cars, you're overtaking, you're pushing harder, you're pushing your brakes harder, you're not getting as good cooling. And I think in the end it just pushed them over the edge. I think we've seen it happen before in the past when Bottas, for example, has dropped back into the pack, things have overheated and you end up retiring. I think it's just a consequence of how intense things are at the front, that every single component of that car is primed for where they anticipate the race panning out. And as a result of that incident, and super strong Mercedes rear suspension, I think we also saw Fernando brush the wall with no consequence as well. It stood up to that, but unfortunately the consequences were the brake problem later on.
Absolutely. And Alex, your thoughts on Mercedes, whether just quickly you think that they have perhaps closed that gap, because Lewis Hamilton said afterwards in the press conferences that perhaps it was the slower corners where they suffered, and he thinks that Aston Martin have pulled out a bit of a performance gap on Mercedes. What's your reading of the current standings?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair from Lewis there. I think things obviously flattered Mercedes in Barcelona to a certain extent with the cooler temperatures. It's a track that everybody knows so well. They can set the cars up pretty much perfectly. It's sort of like a laboratory track, so things came to them. And then Aston obviously having that massive upgrade package, it seems to have brought Aston actually closer to Red Bull. If we look at how the race shakes out today, Max Verstappen wasn't winning by 20-30 seconds. It was much less than that. So that we're going to see that, because obviously Red Bull's got their cost gap penalty, not able to develop as much. But the scary thing is I don't think Max was really pushing. He sort of heard that when it sounded like his engineer was telling him, look, Hamilton and Alonso are pushing behind. So yeah, I think Lewis is right there. I also agree, John. I think George. It wasn't the accident that caused the retirement, but it was at the same time, because you could see him even when he was running at the tail end in the DRS train. He was moving out on the straight to get some cooler air, even doing that when he was behind Albon. So unfortunate for Mercedes, really, because it is looking still pretty close with Aston Martin, and with Lance Stroll, his qualifying underwhelming, underperforming in front of his home crowd. It was there for the taking to, use two cars to try and get up with Alonso, but perhaps Russell maybe just pushing a little bit too hard, because Lewis Hamilton's brilliant at this track. He was ahead of Alonso. They were all together, and it all just got a little bit much and got away from him in that accident.
Verstappen once again in another league, although interestingly, a very in Red Bull terms, a smaller gap to the second place finisher, not including Australia, but safety car doesn't count. So actually this was a pretty close finish as the 2023 season goes. Despite BirdLife getting lodged in one of his brake ducts, he'd nailed RB100, 100 wins for Red Bull, matching Senna's win tally as well. I'm not massively keen on these kind of stats that compare different eras. It's a fascinating stat that was passed on to me, that he's led every lap since Miami. That was May the 7th, and the dominance goes on. But my question to you, John, is similar to what I asked Alex. Do you think the competitors are getting any closer? Because the timesheets suggest they are.
Well, do they suggest they are? I think.
Well, there was an early safety car today which bunched the pack up, but apart from that, they had pretty much a free race to go for it, and it was a little bit closer than we've seen at other races this year. Well,
I think there can be an illusion of just how far ahead teams are or aren't, and often based on how far quickly the people behind are pushing. Because I think some of the gaps we've seen in the past have been the second place guys backed off towards the end. And I think, as both Toto Wolff and Mike Crack said tonight, you never know. If we found another 3 temps and pushed Max a bit harder, does he just rev it up a little bit further and extend that gap even more? So I think it's a mistake to judge dominance and performance based on the number of seconds they finish ahead at the end. I think there is a sense that Aston Martin and Mercedes are making progress, but I still think that gap is 2-3 temps per lap, which over Grand Prix is fairly sizable. In Formula 1 is quite big. I think the day they can stay within undercut territory at the pit stops will be critical for telling us that Red Bull are finally under pressure. Because remember, all those, I'll just go back to the Vettel era when Vettel was dominating. The races, he'd whack it on pole, first few laps break the DRS, and then would happily just sit there with that gap. All the rivals would spend the entire season thinking, we're getting closer, they're not far ahead. But every time they stepped up, Vettel would step up again, and that gap would be exactly the same. So I think we're in that scenario. But I think we also need to see some better tracks. I think this track didn't particularly suit the Red Bull, the cooler temperatures. They weren't especially comfortable on the tyres. But equally, this wasn't a track that suited Mercedes. Didn't particularly suit the Aston Martin characteristics. So let's see Austria, let's see Silverstone. 2 races, 2 different downforce demands. Downforce, the Merc update that's coming for Silverstone. I think then we'll get a picture. If we come out of those 2 races and the gaps are identical, then I think they know they're not making progress.
A quick one, John. In your opinion, why didn't Verstappen go for the fastest lap today? We saw in Barcelona he didn't listen to the team and he went a second quicker when he wanted to keep himself interested. Then he went back to managing the race again. Why didn't that happen here? Why did they pit Perez at the end? And he did get the fastest lap today, taking that point away from from Hamilton, who had it at the time.
Well, I think Max did go for it a couple of laps, or a few laps from the end. Wasn't quite quick enough, and I think Perez had the gap behind him to be able to go for the softs. That gap wasn't there for Max. And I think the second he knew that Checo had pitted and was on fresh rubber, there was no chance he was going to get it. So he took the higher mighty position and said, I'm not going to go for it anyway, because I think it was fairly obvious no matter what he did, he wasn't going to be a set of fresh softs at that stage of the race.
Alex, a quick plug for Red Bull 100 to give our viewers an insight into how these things work. A long time ago, I know that you put to Red Bull, hey, this is coming up, can we talk about it? And they were pretty quick to say, look, let's just focus on going racing. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Didn't want to do like a whole thing before they'd actually done it. And that's really interesting insight into the mindsets of top sports people. They're even Red Bull, so dominant, are like, let's just go racing and let's just... But we can give a little spoiler that perhaps you may have a little bit that our fans, our viewers can get from Red Bull, from the very top of Red Bull. Little tease for that one if you can, either for the website or the magazine.
Yeah, supposed to be speaking to Christian Horner at tomorrow afternoon when he's back from Canada, so fingers crossed no flight delays. Red Bull 100, fantastic achievement for the team. They are the quickest team to 100 wins in terms of years, only doing it in 14 years, but I've got a little stat here, and this is almost like, rough maths. There may be some races where I'm not quite here and there, but Mercedes actually beat them to 100 wins. They did it in 207 races. Red Bull did it in 355. So, yes, fantastic effort from Red Bull. It's been really interesting looking back at their achievements, since winning that first race, China 2009. Spoke to Mark Webber as well. It's really interesting hearing him talk about the growing pains the team had to go through back then, looking back at the reputation they had, just a drinks company. That's what Lewis Hamilton famously said of them. So, fantastic achievement for Red Bull. Webber sort of suggesting they don't really get the credit they deserve in many ways because they're not a manufacturer, and I think there's something to that. There's something sort of, they're not like a legendary team status, but nevertheless fantastic achievement. So yeah, read all about that on autosport.com plus and in Autosport magazine this week. Very quickly, when I said 14 years earlier in reference to Red Bull, that was 14 years between race win number 1 and win number 100. Of course, not 14 years since the team came to the championship, taking over Jaguar 2005.
We will see Vettel behind the wheel again later this year. More on that maybe in a future video. John, let's talk a little bit about Ferrari. They pulled off a strategy call when the safety car came out. They chose to keep track position and not go for a change of tyres, and proved me completely wrong at the time, because I saw this and thought, well, they're doing the opposite to what the leaders have done. This is going to be a classic Ferrari coming home 11th and 12th. The drivers are furious. They had to make a couple of stops. They didn't. They completely made it work. It seems to me like that was the best they could have done today. The Ferraris weren't up there. They were never going to be on the podium, but it seemed like a really strong strategy call. What was your reading on Ferrari today, John?
I think they've got today what they've been lacking almost all season, which is consistency. That car's been in windows, out of windows, tyres performing, tyres not performing, super quick, all over the place. And I think today was just a well-executed day. The car was consistent through the stints. They went in quite comfortable on the strategy. They made the right calls. Leclerc and Sainz working together, which after yesterday's pretty shambolic qualifying, when they didn't make the most of what's been quite a quick car around here, I think it's given them at least a little reason. They're going to hold a meeting at Maranello on Tuesday just to run through what went wrong on Saturday. So there are improvements that can be made: communication, execution, kind of understanding big picture stuff. But I think they'll come out of this weekend slightly encouraged that there's signs of progress with the car. Looked quick in parts on Friday and dry running FP2, consistent in the race today. So maybe there's progress. They're not where they need to be. They're still potentially behind Aston Martin and Mercedes in race pace. But there's a glimmer of hope now that maybe they can start to make progress, and this new development path they've opened up with the updates can deliver some better performance.
It made me smile as well with the radio messages, choosing the phrase, Carlos Sainz will not attack you, which I just thought was slightly a sinister way of putting it. But, when they were calling into Charles Leclerc, hold positions, in other words. Let's talk a little bit about a penalty today for Lando Norris, which had plenty of people scratching their heads. It was not a great day for McLaren today. Still not scoring points for years in Canada. Alex, a 5-second penalty for slowing down too much under the safety car. To leave room for Piastri to allow a double pit stop. But the actual penalty was unsportsmanlike conduct, which was very non-specific in a sport that so often gets tied up in, very, very long explanations. And this one seemed to be sort of just a sweeping statement. We didn't like what you did. But Alex, what are your thoughts on that 5-second penalty for Norris and still no points from McLaren in Canada?
So I have many thoughts on this penalty, but just, yes, this penalty. Right, first of all, what I'm going to do, got a second screen here. I'm going to read you what Lando Norris said to, I think it was one of our reporters, Philip Clearon, in the post-race driver pen. When told about the penalty, talking about that, Norris says, okay, interesting. No, I only got told to box like 3 seconds before the box. By that time, I was flat out, so it doesn't make sense to me. There's plenty of times where you go slow under VSC, so if I get a penalty today, I should get a penalty for the last 3 years as well, and so should everyone else. But no, I don't think I did anything wrong. Now, this is a sports person. They are inclined to react in ways such as this, and fair enough, I take that absolutely well. But it's pretty disingenuous there from Lando, because he is told quite clearly by the team when the safety car's out, you are the second driver, and he doesn't follow Piastri as Piastri accelerates. It's a slam dunk penalty. It is worth 5 seconds. They're not supposed to drop 10 car lengths back behind the safety car. We've been talking about this time and time again. Think back to Singapore last year when Sergio Perez did that, but actually behind the safety car, using it to warm up his tyres. Now, here's where I get really quite annoyed, because, fine, 5 seconds, yeah, unfortunately, Lando, you did it. That's just how it is. But the unsportsmanlike conduct thing makes absolutely no sense, and it's just confused everybody and made ridiculous people like me quite cross. But anyway, basically, I mean, Perez is slam dunk unsportsmanlike conduct penalty in Singapore last year, and he should, get a penalty and lose the win to Charles Leclerc? Of course he should, if that's what they're going on. Nick de Vries not giving Kevin Magnussen room at turn 1, and then it contributes to their shunt later on. He sort of, he makes the move, he defends really fiercely on the outside. How is that not unsportsmanlike conduct? This is, I think it was, this is what Formula One's about. This is what they do. It's just a ridiculously vague thing to give a penalty for, or at least give an explanation of a penalty. And I think the FIA have really made a mistake there, because that's going to be argued completely for things going forward. But yeah, definitely a penalty. Definitely not the right explanation for it.
And this was my point on the Saturday podcast that I did with Jake Boxall-Lake, who's out in Montreal as well, which is why it took 5 or 6 hours for them to finally reach a steward's decision on Hülkenberg and his demotion, in that's just a delta time. This is one of those things that Formula One just makes far too many problems for itself. It's a bit like speeding in the pit lane or being out of your grid position. It's one of those things that everyone can see it. Everyone's got timing screens. You went too fast under red flag. It's tough and it's horrible for Haas, and they had a stinky race anyway. They were never going to keep that second position, but it doesn't take that many hours to decide. Anyway, we've both had a little rant. Let's go back to John to talk about Aston Martin. Alonso now has double the podiums this year than he had in the last 7 seasons combined. Podium Bahrain, podium Saudi Arabia, podium Australia. Baku, 4th, terrible. Podium Miami, podium Monaco, 7th in Spain. Where was he? Podium in Canada today. I'm only joking, of course. He couldn't catch Verstappen, but he had enough in hand to fend off Hamilton. And John, what are your thoughts on whether you think Alonso can beat Perez in that dominant RB19 to second in the Drivers' Championship, and the capability of Aston to bring those updates they need?
I think the gap between Aston Martin and Red Bull's still quite big. I know Fernando on the radio today was talking about, I want to go for this win when he was told to lift and coast, saving fuel. Mike Crack explains tonight there was a fuel system problem that he wouldn't explain in detail to us. Just said there's a fuel system problem. They were worried they were going to not have enough fuel at the end of the race. I tried to probe him on what the fuel system problem was, but he wasn't having any of it. In the end, the problem wasn't real, and they did have enough fuel, so Fernando could have pushed harder, but it wasn't enough to close that gap. So they're still behind Red Bull. I think that battle is key, and if Perez pulls his socks up, basically, that Red Bull is by far the best car. That Red Bull in Perez's hands should be finishing second at every single race if Max is winning, and it's not at the moment. So I think he just needs to kind of get his act together, get his confidence back, and start delivering on Saturdays, because I think the way DRS trains are in Formula 1 now, the way overtaking is hard, the way there isn't much strategy variation in terms of kind of tyre life that we've seen in the past. It's what made Barcelona quite a good race in terms of overtaking. Means that if he's not qualifying up the front, he's not going to be able to race there. So it's down to Checo getting his act together now on Saturdays.
And Alex, every time he turns around, there's a smiling Australian in the third seat, or whatever that role is that Daniel Ricciardo is this year. But they're not short of talent. That if Perez loses his head or for whatever reason, just the last three qualifyings have just been just mind-boggling. Whether if Perez needs a summer break to get himself together or to spend time with his coaches or whatever, there's the option of Red Bull to go, well, you know what, we've got plenty of talent that we could put in that car. Alex, you've been pretty honest, I think, on Perez, even when you're on the Autosport podcast over the years, when he's had a good performance and a bad one, you've not been afraid to say. What's your thoughts on how his season's unravelled a little bit lately? Yeah,
pretty shockingly unravelled, I'd say, because he was excellent at the start of the year. Really, really good in Jeddah, then the sort of baffling off in Australia in qualifying, and then he comes roaring back after that. But yeah, it's interesting because basically what has happened is what everyone predicted, or certainly what we predicted, is that as soon as we got to proper tracks, as soon as we got off the street tracks that we know Perez loves, Verstappen was going to have him. But what was really odd was that crash in qualifying in Monaco, because that's the sort of territory where he absolutely excels. And Christian Horner suggested that, he was feeling the pressure of the title fight. Perez, rather understandably, says no, that's not the case. But I think there's more to what Horner's saying than the obvious, comeback from Perez. It's just that it is incredibly hard going up against Max Verstappen. Unfortunately, things have played out exactly as everyone expected on those higher speed tracks where Verstappen is much better. And yeah, can Alonso beat him to second place? I mean, if he carries on driving like this, it's going to be very, very close. I mean, I thought what was more interesting is that this is a realistic goal for Alonso, who was at one point talking about beating Verstappen to the world title. And then in Spain, when he was behind Lance Stroll and saying, don't worry, I'm not going to attack, I think that revealed that even Fernando knew that he wasn't going to actually beat Verstappen to the world championship, or he would have been demanding to be let by to get every single point that he could. But yeah, Perez, he can do it. We've got a sprint race coming up, Red Bull's home race next in Austria, so that provides an opportunity. But I think qualifying is the key thing. Unfortunately, after that, it's a really high-speed track at Silverstone. You've got Spa, where Verstappen dominates as well. In terms of the world title, it's when, if not if, when it comes to Verstappen. And yeah, Perez has got to step it up, because Alonso's not giving up. Lewis Hamilton, did you see him throwing his car at the scenery all day, chasing Alonso late on, which actually showed, I thought, how good Alonso's drive was. So even with the fuel system thing, he was still able to keep a gap to Hamilton, who was absolutely on it. So yeah, if Perez isn't careful, Alonso could well have him, yeah.
Well, thank you for mentioning the Red Bull Ring. Couple of weeks to wait, and then we'll be off to Austria. I guess would have been a nice place to do Red Bull 100, but they'll take it in Canada. What do you think about today's Grand Prix that we saw? Let us know in the comments below about the standout performances. Alex Albon, driver of the day, just brilliant. And whether you think that the competitors are closing the gap to Red Bull, or whether they're just managing that gap. Let us know in the comments below what you think about all the issues that we have discussed today. We love to read those. And if you're not subscribed yet to the channel, you can hit subscribe and the thumbs up icon. It tells us you like this video, and we'll make more just like it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.